All right, welcome to Hard Slab Construction, the Mushroom Edition. So here's the tools I'm going to need: a ruler, X-Acto knife, and a fettling knife. I have my slab. It is leather hard, so when I pick it up it's not too flexible or anything along those lines, but it also hasn't changed color. I'm going to start off with a little round thing to create the top of it, and it doesn't need to be anything perfect because I'm not actually looking for it to be perfect. So I'm just kind of doing this rough draft. I know that I want my circle to be in there. Basically, like we've talked about this before, but we're going to do darting in order to make it so that I'm creating the right form. So everything that we make is just like when we were working with soft slab, we can go back and we can cut out these individual pieces. Everywhere that I want there to be a curve, I'm going to create a cut. And then I'll work back and see how many pieces I actually need, because not all of these pieces will be necessary to create that little form. I'm starting from that center point because the center point is what I actually want to be the top of my mushroom. And I'm using my X-Acto knife to make my cuts, and I'm trying to do kind of like a 90-degree angle to cut. And then I'm going to go back and I actually have to adjust the angle on these pieces so that when I set them on there, they'll come off at the right angle. So I'm playing around with it a little bit. The nice part about this kind of method is since I'm not going for something, I'm creating a form that is actually relatively organic, using a form that is not, doesn't lend itself that well towards organics. So in that process, I'm going to make sure that anywhere that I want to curve, I have a cut. So hence I got lots of cuts. Now, when I join my pieces back together, I have to deal with the gaps in between the pieces. So I can do that in a couple of different ways. But the most important bit is that I get everything scored and slipped on there very well. And you can see that I get little and you can see the bead line of the slip forming up. If you have a lot of slip going in between those two, then it's all good. So I wanted to close that gap in a little bit, so I removed some clay, and then I also am going back and really scoring and slipping those little sections so that I have slip bulging out of each one of the cracks. So every time I'm scoring and slipping, I'm taking my scoring tool and then I'll score all of the sides that are going to touch. So I'm using my Sureform right now to make it so that it has the right angle, so that when they go to connect it, they actually have a fairly close connection. I can fudge it a little bit just by how much slip that I'm putting over on the side, because it does make those areas kind of squishy. But I do want to make sure, if you notice, I keep going back. I put a little bit of water on and then I scratch. I put a little bit of water on and then I scratch. I try to do that like 3 times on each one of the pieces. And then this is just a whole process of me figuring out the right angle. So I do really so when we were talking about a couple of different ways that we can make the shape the right thing, one of that is going back and just cutting it. We could actually try to go out and mathematically figure out those lines, or we can eyeball it, which is what I'm doing. And I'm using, again, that Sureform, this little gray piece, as a thing to actually help me create the angles that I need. So if my pieces don't totally fit together, I just shave down the excess. And I'm kind of happy with it not being totally together. It gives it a little bit more irregularity that makes it have a little bit more of a natural feel to it. So I'm so far so good. Happy with how this is going. As I get closer to the end, it's more important for me to kind of test out and make sure that all of my pieces actually fit. I'm figuring out how to get that at the right angle. because I do want to make sure that those planes have as much surface area touching as humanly possible. Now, this is definitely sped up, so that way you guys can see me go through the entire process instead of the boring part where we have to watch me score and slip every single piece. But you will have to score and slip every single piece well. If you're doing this and your slabs are getting bone dry or leather hard, like a stiff leather hard, then you got to go back and keep all of those slabs that you're working with that you haven't used yet. Keep those covered, especially if you're working outside. If you're working outside, you need to make sure that those things are not getting exposed to too much air or heat, because that's where this project can go wrong for people, is once they try to work with this when it's too dry. Now, if you wanted to do something like this where it was a little bit more planned out and you didn't want to do the freeform thing, you could easily do this with a piece of cardboard or stiff construction paper and just kind of get the general outline of the shapes that you need to cut out first. Don't cut your shapes out until your piece is leather hard. If you try to cut your pieces out while they're wet, what's going to happen is that they will deform as you move them around because they're wet. So you will then be battling a whole, you'll still have to go back and clean up all of the sides and that sort of stuff. Plus, they might be a little bit less clean in terms of being on the surface or even being a consistent thickness. So get your slab leather hard, then cut it up. Also remember that if you're putting these together and there's not a big bead trail of slip, then you are doing it wrong, and your piece will come apart. So this one I had a pretty significant cut down for this one. So, but that's also the glory of this. And you can see I only actually took out maybe like 3 darts to remove that shape to actually bring it in. So it is important that you keep all of your pieces while you're working on it, if we're going that freeform kind of method. Now, once you get all of these pieces together, now we have to clean up all of the sides. Now, this can take some time. So I'm using my smooth rib. If anything that has a clean straight line is going to do well for you, but if you have a plastic one, that's going to be the best option. But I want to go back over every single seam and clean that up, check them, like actually wiggle the seam, make sure that the seams don't come apart. So check your work all the time. That's like super important. If you start to see a crack forming, especially in a greenware stage, it's not going to get better for you. So you definitely want to make sure that you keep those. If you can fix it while it's green, then we're good. If you can fix it while it's leather hard, then we're great. If you're trying to fix it when it's bone dry, that's not going to go well. Okay, so now I'm ready to switch over to do the stem and the underside of my piece. So I'm going to go with the same method where I'm just going to get my generalized like circle, and this can be for the bottom bit. Now, if I want it to have any curve, then that means I have to cut it, right? So one of the things that we're not going to do is if you're bending the slab to make it do what you want it to do, then you're not doing it right. The whole idea here is that we are working with a flat, plain surface and creating all of these different little forms. So again, I chose like a middle point, and then I lined it up with each one of the planes on my cap. And then I'll just cut out the center because I know I won't need that. And again, I'm just cutting straight out to the little edges where I had those planes already created so that they match and line up with that. Okay, and they'll be a little bit bigger than what I need, which is perfect because that way I can go back and I can shave everything down. But you can see how they don't quite line up at this point. So I have to go in and I have to shave down all of these little sections, especially the edge, because the edge is actually going onto a flat plane. And then I can also make it so that there's an angle enough that it sits flat against the wall of my cap. And I didn't try to attach it there. I just put a little bit of water just so I could see what was going on, and kind of have it in place. So I'm going to get these pieces like sort of in the right spot before I start. You guys get to have a really good view of my roots or whatever. I'm just excited that I kept it all in frame this time. Okay, back to our scoring. Now, one of the things that I want to be really careful about in this process too is as I'm adding water and kind of scoring and putting these pieces in place, I do want to be really careful about getting too much water in the cap of my little fungus. Because if I have water pooling, especially right on the seams, remember water breaks down clay, and so I don't want to have pools of water in my seams. So I'm going to be careful about where I put things. Also making sure again that I have all of my edges get some nice goop coming out of the corners, and that should keep everything together. So I'm just cutting the inside angle of that top bit so that I can fit that in there nice and tight. If you don't have a Sureform, you can just do it with a knife instead. But the Sureform is great because it works as a plane. If you have the smaller Sureform that is rounded, just be careful about what angle that you're kind of holding that on. You can see I kind of like to set up like 3 or 4 pieces and get them in place first, and then make sure that they're in the right shape, and then I'll go back and I'll connect them all. What I'm expecting for this project from you guys is that all of our lines are clean or purposely. If they're not clean, then they have to be very purposeful on that front. But like there's one, sometimes people will use the edge or the seam, kind of like what I'm doing right now, where there's little raised elements and that kind of stuff. as part of the piece. I do want my slabs to show up, but that is also my personal preference. If you would like your slabs to be less obvious, by all means, smooth them out. You're better off making pieces that are a little bit too big for what you need than making pieces that are too small. And I definitely want to get these last two little pieces like well fit before I try to um, finish this all off. And remember when you're doing the lines that you should be building up goop on your pieces. If you're not building up goop, it's no good. So now I can kind of go back and just sort of like, so I'm going to clean up all of these little edges. And right now I'm just using the edge of my trimming tool, my loop tool, so that I can just kind of smooth out those corners, get rid of all of the gobbledygook, make sure that my edges all look clean. And it's helpful to let that stuff set up. If you're working on something and it's getting worse instead of better, then you should let it set up a little bit more. But again, don't let your stuff get too dried out. Okay, so we did the underside, and now I'm going to do the stem. And so I just kind of measured how big I wanted the stem to be with a string. And then marked it out onto my slab so that I knew that I had enough clay to go all the way around. Now I don't really care, and I actually kind of want my lines to be a little bit irregular, so that way when I make my form, it will also be slightly irregular. So all of these little pieces, now I have to go back and put them together and make sure that the angle comes together right. So I haven't cut out the bottom piece of my top yet, of my mushroom cap, because I want to make, when I cut it out, I want to cut it out directly to fit my stem. Again, making sure that I have really good connection and that I have goop coming out of the sides. If you don't have goop coming out of the sides, you didn't do it right, and your piece will come apart. And I generally try to scratch it up like 3 different directions, so like kind of a left diagonal, a right diagonal, and then like a straight up and down. Something to make it a nice slippy mess. And this time I don't really care whether or not my pieces are going back in the same sort of order. I just need to get some pieces together. Now I could have made this with 4 sides, but I wanted to make it look a little bit more curved and a little bit more irregular, so I'm making it with 5, possibly 6. So now I have a space that's like way smaller than what I have there. So I'm just going to scrape this all down. Totally not cutting myself. And then match the angles to go with the piece. And then I want to put a little diagonal in there. So I'm just kind of envisioning that. But first, let's get this done. The last little piece. And then we'll go back and smooth out all the sides. And generally it'll take multiple passes for you to kind of clear that up. Okay, so that fits in that space well enough. So I just wanted to test, so I did a little test of an angle to see how it was going to kind of cut. Because I do want it to bend. So instead of trying to, so there you go, you can see how you can actually create a little bend, and depending on how much I rotate it, I can change that bend. Okay, and I'm going to push that really nicely together. And I actually really like that little like ridge there because it looks like a skirt to the fungus. So I'm going to leave that there. And I'm going to mark out my top. And then we'll cut that to fit. I want to cut a little bit smaller than what I need, and then I'll shave down the other piece to like kind of fit in there. Because again, it's going to be a bummer if that's too, if it's too big, it's hard to go back. Clean up those edges a little bit. Okay, so I feel pretty good about that, but I do need to figure out how to get that. So I have this little gap over here. I got to take care of that business. So I'll just take a little wedge of clay, score and slip that little section. There we go. Now I don't have a hole on the side anymore. Okay, so I could leave that there and I could actually just create that as my connection point, but remember that we do want to actually make this into a jar form. So what I'm going to do is actually take part of this and create a slightly smaller opening. So while this piece did not totally fit into the edge before, now it will. And it's because I'm taking off like half of the side. So I went and that's the angle. Oops, dropped my thing. And I'll clean off the top. Okay, and now that has a set location that it fits into. So that's going to be my stopper. Now I have to do I'm going to seal the base. And again, just going and using that as my initial piece as a template. And I have it at an angle, so that way, again, it has a little bit more of an organic form to it. And then I'm actually going back over this little section here because I want to create a little bit more of a texture on that side, like a purposeful mess. So that way I can have it look again a little bit more like that skirt that's on that little fungus. Make sure that that piece fits the side well. And then I can cut off all the excess. Clean up all the sides. Reapply my texture. Clean up all the nonsense on the top of my piece. And then test and see how that looks. All right. I made it. Yay. Let's clean our space. There it is. I made it. It sits with a lid. Yay.